When you cannot rely on mock-ups, screenshots, or clickable prototypes, privacy analysis can feel harder because so much of the user's experience is normally communicated through what people see. Yet privacy outcomes are shaped just as much by what people understand, what choices feel available, and what happens by default, and those elements can be analyzed through careful description even when you never look at a screen. In many real projects, you will not have visuals at the moment decisions are being made, either because the design is still forming, the work is happening quickly, or you are reviewing an idea that is described in writing rather than drawn. The challenge is to avoid guessing and to avoid reducing privacy to legal language, because the lived experience of privacy is mostly about interaction. If a user feels surprised, pressured, or misled, the privacy impact is real even if the policy text is technically correct. The goal here is to learn how to analyze privacy impacts in the user experience without visual aids by asking precise questions, listening for hidden assumptions, and translating narrative descriptions into concrete privacy behaviors you can evaluate. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong starting point is to define what we mean by user experience, UX, in a privacy context, because beginners often treat UX as color palettes, button shapes, and layout choices. In privacy work, UX is more about how a person encounters data collection, what they believe is happening, and what control they feel they have as they move through the product. It includes timing, such as whether a permission is requested before the user understands why it matters, and it includes framing, such as whether a choice is described in neutral terms or in language that pressures agreement. It also includes defaults, because the default behavior often becomes the actual behavior for most people, especially when settings are buried or confusing. Another part of UX is consequence, meaning what happens when a user declines an optional use, because a choice is not meaningful if declining breaks the core service or triggers repeated nagging prompts. When you analyze UX without visuals, you are still analyzing these elements, but you do it by building a clear mental model from words and verifying that model through specific, testable questions. If you can describe the interaction precisely, you can assess its privacy impact precisely. Before you analyze any flow, you need to build a narrative version of the user journey that is detailed enough to reveal privacy behavior. This is where many beginners struggle because they accept vague descriptions like users are prompted for consent, which hides critical differences in how the prompt works. A good narrative includes who the user is, what they are trying to accomplish, and what steps they take from entry to completion, including where the system asks for information, where it explains things, and where it saves or shares data. You do not need visual assets to write that narrative. You need clarity from the team about what the user sees and does in each moment. Ask what triggers the request, what happens if the user says no, and whether the user can change the decision later. Ask whether the system collects anything before the prompt appears, such as device identifiers or event logs, because that can contradict the idea of a choice. Ask what happens for returning users, because a first-time flow can look respectful while later behavior quietly expands tracking. When the narrative is complete, you can analyze privacy impact by comparing what the user likely believes with what the system actually does. An important concept in privacy analysis is expectation alignment, which is the gap between what users reasonably think will happen and what will actually happen. Without visuals, you assess expectation alignment by examining language, timing, and context in the described flow. For example, if a feature is described as helping users find nearby content, users might reasonably expect approximate location use during the feature, but they might not expect background location collection all day. If a setting is described as improving recommendations, users might expect content personalization, but not sharing of behavioral data to advertising partners. Expectation alignment also depends on whether the product operates in a sensitive context, such as health, finance, or children's services, because expectations are higher and tolerance for surprise is lower. Beginners sometimes assume expectations are subjective and therefore unmeasurable, but you can evaluate them by asking what a reasonable person would infer from the described interaction. The sharper your narrative, the easier this becomes, because the analysis can point to exact moments where confusion or surprise would likely occur. When expectation alignment is weak, privacy risk rises because users feel tricked even if the organization believes it disclosed information somewhere. Strong analysis identifies where the story the user experiences diverges from the story the system tells internally. Defaults are one of the biggest privacy impact drivers, and analyzing them without visuals means paying attention to what happens when the user does nothing special. If the system collects data immediately upon installation, that is the default, even if a settings page later allows opt-out. If a toggle is presented but is pre-enabled, the default is enabled, even if the user technically had a choice. If a user must take extra steps to choose a privacy-protective option, such as searching for a hidden setting, the default path will dominate actual outcomes. A beginner mistake is treating settings as equal choices, as if users will explore and configure thoughtfully, when most users will not. In an audio-first analysis, you ask whether the core service works acceptably under the most privacy-protective choices, because meaningful choice requires that declining non-essential uses does not punish the user. You also ask whether defaults vary by region, device, or user type, because inconsistent defaults can create unequal privacy outcomes. When you cannot see a screen, you can still analyze defaults by asking teams to describe exact initial states and the easiest path through the flow. Defaults are privacy design, not a cosmetic detail. Another major area is consent and permission behavior, which can be evaluated through words and logic even without visual design. You assess whether the choice is specific, informed, and timed appropriately, and whether the user can revisit it later. A prompt that appears before the user understands the feature can produce compliance without understanding, which is not a strong foundation for trust. A prompt that bundles multiple purposes together can make it hard for users to make a meaningful decision, especially when purposes have different sensitivity levels. You also evaluate whether the system respects the choice in practice, such as whether data collection stops when the user declines, and whether the system avoids repeated prompts that pressure the user over time. Beginners often assume consent is binary, but many systems have layered choices, like enabling analytics but not marketing, or allowing approximate location but not precise. Even without visuals, you can analyze whether those layers exist and whether they map to actual data routing behaviors. You can also evaluate whether consent is being used as a substitute for minimization, because asking permission to collect more than needed is still risky when the context involves power imbalance or low user understanding. Consent is a tool, not a permission slip for unlimited collection. Transparency is closely related, but transparency is not just about having a policy, and you can analyze transparency without visuals by focusing on message content, placement, and clarity. Ask what the user is told at the moment data is collected, in language that fits the user's context and avoids vague terms like improved services. Ask whether the explanation identifies key points users care about, such as whether data is shared with third parties, whether it is used for advertising, and how long it is kept. Ask whether the explanation uses concrete examples or whether it hides behind general categories that users cannot interpret. Another crucial transparency question is whether the explanation matches reality, such as whether a system claims to collect only basic analytics while sending identifiers and detailed event streams to external services. Beginners sometimes think transparency is a legal checklist, but for decision-ready analysis, you treat transparency as a risk control that reduces surprise and complaint likelihood. Without visuals, you can still evaluate whether the explanation is likely to be understood by a new user, whether it is short enough to be read in context, and whether it is connected to a clear choice. If transparency is weak, users may feel manipulated even if the system is technically compliant. Data minimization in UX is often overlooked because teams focus on back-end engineering, but the interface is where many extra data fields are created. Without visuals, you examine what information the user is asked to provide, whether each data element is necessary, and whether the request is framed as required when it is not. For example, a checkout flow might ask for a phone number, but if it is truly optional, the analysis should ensure users understand that and can proceed without it. A profile setup might ask for a birth date, but the question is why, and whether a less sensitive alternative exists. Minimization also includes reducing data precision, such as using a city rather than exact location, or using broad categories rather than detailed free text. Beginners often miss the risk of free text fields, which can capture sensitive information unpredictably, especially when users treat a field like a conversation. A strong analysis asks whether free text is needed, how it is constrained, and where it is stored and shared, because free text often flows into analytics, support systems, and training datasets. Minimization is not only a database discipline, it is a question design discipline, and UX is where that discipline begins. Another privacy impact area is dark patterns and coercive design, and you can analyze these without visuals by paying attention to described incentives and friction. If the flow is described as nudging users to accept tracking to get a better experience, ask what better means and whether it is genuine or manipulative. If declining a choice results in repeated prompts, blocked features, or confusing errors, that is a privacy impact because it undermines meaningful consent. If a flow offers a privacy option but describes it in negative terms, such as making the user feel unsafe or disloyal for choosing it, that can pressure decisions in ways that are unfair. Beginners sometimes treat these issues as subjective, but you can ground them by asking whether the user can reasonably complete the core task without agreeing to non-essential processing and whether the consequences of declining are proportionate. You also assess whether the flow uses default settings that favor collection, because defaults combined with persuasive language can function as coerced consent. Even without seeing the screen, the team's description often reveals where friction is placed, such as requiring extra steps to opt out or burying a setting deep in account controls. A careful analysis calls out these patterns and ties them to trust risk and compliance risk in a way stakeholders can understand. Privacy impacts also show up in how systems handle errors, edge cases, and recovery flows, which are often forgotten when teams describe the happy path. Without visuals, ask what happens when a user enters incorrect information, cancels a process, or abandons a flow halfway through. Does the system still save partial data? And if so, for how long and for what purpose? Does the system log full inputs and error logs, which can unintentionally capture sensitive data? Does a recovery flow require sharing additional personal data, such as uploading identity documents? And is that proportional to the risk being addressed? Beginners often assume abandoned flows do not matter, but abandoned carts, incomplete onboarding steps, and failed identity checks can create datasets that linger and become a privacy liability. Another important error path question is whether users are informed when something fails, because unclear errors can lead users to overshare, like repeatedly entering information or providing extra details in a comment field. A decision-ready UX privacy analysis demands a narrative not only for success but for failure, because many privacy exposures originate in troubleshooting and logging behavior. When you include these paths, you identify controls like field masking, shorter retention, and restricted access that reduce risk without harming usability. Cross-context linking is another area where UX choices drive privacy outcomes, especially when products encourage users to connect accounts, contacts, or devices. Without visuals, you analyze what is being linked, why it is offered, and what the consequences are for privacy. If an app encourages connecting a social account, ask what data flows in, what data flows out, and whether linking is required or optional. If the product offers address book syncing, ask whether contacts are uploaded, hashed, or processed on device, and whether non-users are affected because their information is being shared. If the product offers cross-device syncing, ask what is synced, whether messages or activity history are included, and how that data is protected. Beginners often focus on user convenience and ignore the privacy cost of linking, which is that separate parts of life become connected and inference becomes easier. You also evaluate whether users understand the scope of linking, because linking is often described as a simple login step, while the backend creates broad data consolidation. Without visuals, you can still analyze whether the language used implies more limited impact than reality. A strong analysis recommends ways to limit linking, such as providing clear explanations, offering alternatives, and ensuring users can disconnect later without losing core functionality. Retention and deletion are UX issues as well, because users experience privacy not only through collection, but through whether they can manage and remove their data. Without visuals, ask what controls exist for users to view what is stored, to correct errors, and to delete data, and how those controls are described. If a user deletes something, ask whether deletion is immediate, whether it is reversible, and whether copies remain in backups or shared systems. If a user closes an account, ask what happens to their content, their identifiers, and their data in analytics systems, because users often assume account closure means removal. Beginners sometimes treat deletion as an internal process, but if users cannot find or trust deletion controls, the privacy impact is practical and emotional, not theoretical. Another important question is whether the product explains retention in plain terms, such as how long certain categories are kept and why, especially for sensitive data. Without visuals, you can still evaluate whether the described experience sets realistic expectations, such as telling users that certain records must be retained for legal reasons, while still committing to delete what is not needed. Good UX supports privacy by making data lifecycle understandable and controllable, which reduces conflict and surprise. Testing privacy UX without visuals relies on structured interviewing and scenario walkthroughs that focus on what the user hears, sees, and decides at each moment. You can ask designers and product managers to read the exact wording they intend to use, to describe where the wording appears, and to explain what happens after each possible user response. You can ask engineers to describe what data is sent at each step and whether the system collects anything before the user makes a choice. You can ask support teams what users commonly misunderstand, because misunderstanding is a signal of UX privacy risk. Beginners sometimes think analysis requires seeing the final interface, but you can often detect high-risk patterns early through these conversations, because the risk lies in the structure of the interaction, not in the styling. Another useful technique is to restate the flow in your own words and ask the team to correct you, because gaps in shared understanding often reveal hidden complexity. When the team cannot answer specific questions about what is collected and when, that is itself a finding, because uncertainty often means uncontrolled tracking or unclear defaults. Decision-ready analysis turns these conversations into concrete requirements, like delaying collection until after a choice, simplifying language, or ensuring opt-out paths are functional. It is also important to connect UX privacy analysis to broader system controls, because interface choices must map to backend behavior to be meaningful. If the interface offers a toggle to disable personalized ads, the backend must actually stop sending identifiers to advertising partners, not merely stop showing personalized content while still collecting the same data. If the interface says location is used only while the feature is active, the backend must avoid background collection and must avoid retaining precise histories. If the interface promises deletion, the data pipeline must support deletion across systems, including derived datasets and vendor stores. Beginners often think UX analysis ends with improving wording, but wording is only honest when it matches reality. Without visuals, you can still demand this alignment by asking what technical mechanism enforces the promise and how the team will verify it. You can also evaluate whether monitoring exists to detect drift, such as new event fields appearing or new third-party endpoints being added. When UX and backend are aligned, users experience privacy as a reliable property of the product rather than as a marketing claim. That alignment is what turns an audio-first analysis into real risk reduction. Analyzing UX privacy impacts without visual aids is ultimately about building a precise, testable story of the user's interaction and then judging that story against privacy principles in a way that supports decisions. You begin by treating UX as the user's understanding, choices, defaults, and consequences, not as decoration, and you build a detailed narrative of what happens at each step. You evaluate expectation alignment, because surprise is a core privacy harm, and you scrutinize defaults because defaults become reality for most users. You assess consent, permissions, and transparency through timing and language, and you test whether choices are meaningful by examining what happens when users decline. You examine minimization at the point of data entry and detect coercive patterns by looking for friction and pressure in the described flow. You include error paths, linking behaviors, and lifecycle controls because those areas often hide overcollection and retention creep. You use structured walkthroughs to turn vague descriptions into concrete requirements, And you insist on alignment between interface promises and backend enforcement so transparency is honest. When you do this well, you can deliver sharp privacy analysis even with no visuals at all, because the privacy impact lives in the logic of interaction and the reality of data behavior, and both can be evaluated through disciplined, detailed narration.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.